Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Weeb Union, and in this one, we start out in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, where the Russians have advanced in the direction of Hrodivka, reaching the outskirts of the town. To the south of it, along the first lines west of Hrodivka, the Russians have stormed Ukrainian fortified positions and are assaulting a second one in the direction of the village of Hrodivka. To the north, the Russians have captured the majority of Ivanivka, leaving only a small part remaining under Ukrainian control, adjacent to a series of Ukrainian fortified positions. This final advance was confirmed with this geolocated footage showing Russian troops here in the western parts of Ivanivka. The Russian operations here near Pokrovsk moves on to Hrodivka, which is the northern flank of the defensive positions of the Ukrainians here west of Pokrovsk. The Ukrainian defensive positions form a line from Hrodivka down to Novhrodivka and ahead of it, where the Ukrainian fortified positions here form multiple lines of defense. And Hrodivka is both connected to this second line of defense as well as the third line of defense, meaning if the Russians gain control of it, they can flank both of these lines by moving on to Mirnorad rather than moving down south to Novhrodivka, and the second and third lines of defense still can bypass both of them by moving through the northern flank. However, the Ukrainians do also have heavily fortified positions to the north. This means that the Russians in this case would be launching operations in between two well-fortified Ukrainian positions to the north and to the south. And as long as one side has a strong flank, as I always say, they'll be able to launch offensive operations. They would be looking to cut off the Russian advance by hitting them in their flank. Since the Russians in this case would not have a strong flank, as they would only have captured Hrodivka. Therefore, the Russians are moving on a wider front where they're also pushing towards Novhrodivka and combining an assault from beyond the third line of defense with an assault on the third line of defense would significantly improve the possibilities that the Russians would have in such an assault. Therefore, we see that the Russians will here focus both on Novhrodivka as well as Hrodivka at the same time, to then push beyond the third line of defense while breaching the second line of defense, to then gain access past the third line of defense before they then reach their final line of defense near Pokrovsk at the outskirts of the city. To put it into different stages, the first stage would be an attack to gain control over the southern bank of the river line and Hrodivka, as well as a push through towards Orlivka, Shuravka, and so on, to then hit Novhrodivka from this northern direction, combined with assaults towards Mykolaiivka here in the south and along the railways towards Novhrodivka, to then gain control of it. Therefore, the first stage would be to gain control over this general area, where the Russians will then look to improve their positions in that general direction. The second stage would be a push down south from Shelane through Novoshelane and down along the Vovche river line, gaining control over the southern flank, and then move on to the second stage in the western parts, which is to flank the third line of defense through assaults towards Mirnorad, and to separate between these two assaults to also push in the southern direction towards the third line of defense and flanking that to gain control over that part as well, and at the same time to move in the northern direction towards Myrolyubivka and Mykolaiivka and Novoekonomichne. So we see these three towns here on the northern flank, Mirnorad to the northwest, and the third line of defense further south. That is the third line of defense and the second stage. Therefore, we can see that the first stage would be something along capturing the second line of defense and breaching the third line of defense, and whilst at the same time securing the southern flank. The second phase would be to secure the northern flank, storm Mirnorad, and gain control over the third line of defense. And then comes the third stage, which is the siege of Pokrovsk, which would happen over a long period of time, as the Ukrainians would send significant forces to hold the city, as it is one of the most important parts of the Donetsk region, considering most supplies goes through it, through Pokrovsk from Zaporizhia, from Dnipro and through towards Hrodivka. This is about half of all of the supplies that goes into the Donetsk region, with the other half coming from the northern side. And this is exactly how the Russians plan on significantly weakening the Ukrainian positions in the Donetsk region by limiting how much can even arrive, which means that there are less troops that the Ukrainians can even support in the region. In the New York direction, there are both advances by the Russians and the Ukrainians, where the Ukrainians are pushing back the Russian foothold in the eastern parts. We already saw a counterattack in the northwestern parts. Now we're seeing a counterattack in the northeastern parts. This points towards reinforcements arriving in the New York section of the front line, where they're looking to regain control over the city, or at the very least, strengthen their defensive positions. We see that based on the counterattack in the northwest, which allows the Ukrainians to recapture the majority of the area north of the river line, and now a second counterattack here to the east, which was geolocated with this footage here, confirming Ukrainian and Russian presence in the northern parts of the river line. So we see Ukrainians are sending a new operation here in New York, where they're looking to regain control over the city. Southwest of the city, the Russians are pushing west of Hrodivka, gaining control over the forest areas and strengthening the western flank. So we see that the Russians and the Ukrainians are both launching offensive operations as the fight over New York continues. In the Kursk section of the front line, we see that there has been no territorial changes since my last update. According to the latest reports, the Russians have now successfully established a front line. This means that they are leaving no gaps in their defenses, unlike previously where, due to the lack of a front line, the Ukrainians were able to simply move through the frontline positions, drive up to a new town, and take control of it with just a few soldiers. This led to the Ukrainians capturing a significant amount of towns and villages as they moved through, and they even occupied ones beyond the current position in the direction of Hrodivka and so on. However, now that the Russians have established a front line, they have been able to stabilize the front line by recapturing positions that were previously contested or weak frontline positions the Ukrainians had, which allowed the Russians to improve their positions just so slightly. And since then, there's been many clashes back and forth as some of the heaviest fighting in the entire war has started. According to some Russian sources, the Ukrainians are using more armored vehicles right now than they did during the last summer offensive. This just shows how the majority of the aid from the $60 billion aid package the United States sent to Ukraine this year went to this attack. We have previously seen how the Ukrainian forces in the east are struggling with both equipment, manpower, and pretty much everything. They do not have nearly enough of anything. This raised the question, why is that when the Ukrainians received a $60 billion aid package from the United States, how are they still lacking so much in so many things here 3 months later? This is simply because the majority of it went to Ukrainian reserves, and these Ukrainian reserves are now fighting in the Kursk region. There are multiple estimates as to how many Ukrainian soldiers are here. A Forbes article estimated somewhere between 6,000 to 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and other articles have mentioned up to 20,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And these are all mechanized units. This means that they have plenty of armored vehicles, they have plenty of tanks, they have artillery cover, they have air defense, they have everything they need for a combined arms offensive operation. And that is exactly what they launched. Their objective was to capture as much as possible in the shortest time possible, which led to these deep incursions. However, the Ukrainian offensive is now limited to the area we see on the front line. The Ukrainians still have the ability to launch attacks in other parts of the front line. However, the difference between these other parts compared to where they launched their offensive is that the Russians have not cleared their own mines in the other areas. And instead of not learning from their mistake this time around, they actually went straight to doubling up or tripling down on the mine laying. So at every other part of the border that isn't right here between the Kursk and Sumy region, their minefields have increased significantly as the Russians just went all out on planting these mines while the Ukrainian offensive is ongoing to avoid the Ukrainians from opening up another front. This does not mean that it will not happen and that it is impossible to happen, but simply it is much more difficult than what they had achieved this first time around. They also lack the element of surprise now that they have already launched their offensive, and therefore the Russians are prepared. They have sent their reinforcements to the area, and they are now with a full front line established. Therefore, it is unlikely that we see the Ukrainians continue with these large distance covered offensive operations where they capture several villages and 100 square kilometers in a single day. It is likely that we are now in a position where positional fighting will happen until the Ukrainians are either pushed out or they break the Russian line and then restart their offensive operations where they constantly break through. According to the reports by the Russians, the Ukrainian offensive forces, which their objective is simply to continue advancing and break through the Russian lines, continuously attack the Russian positions, but with the front line established, it is difficult for them to break through, and they have yet to succeed with such a breakthrough. According to the latest reports, the Ukrainians attempted a breakthrough south of Sucha. However, this failed due to the Russian establishment of a front line. So currently we see the front line is established, and this makes it significantly more difficult for the Ukrainians to break through the Russian lines. And that is the current situation. The Ukrainians are digging in, trying to hold their currently held positions. They continue offensive operations to try and break through the Russian lines. The Russian front line has been established, and this makes it much easier for them to successfully defend the front line. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.